how many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Brene. I'm a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And the a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: "Damn you, Steve." Who's my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of that story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all, like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the no thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
Well, you were just listening to some more Brene Brown on this week's episode of the podcast. And when I heard Brene Brown talk about blame and accountability, I cringed. I am a black belt in blame. And this plagued me for years as a coach. Still plagues me today in some ways. A turnover would happen. The locker room's messy. A player shows up late. We lose a game we shouldn't have lost. And I'd get angry. I'd get really angry and lash out at the players. I'd blame them. I'd blame them for whatever went wrong. And I would justify all that blame, with somebody has to be held accountable, right? Somebody has to be held accountable. In the day, it was kind of a bunch of nonsense, my justifications for it. When you think about it. It was a lack of ownership on my part as a leader. And you cannot get to the root of the problem when you are just stewing in anger. It just doesn't work. Now, my issues aren't everybody's issues as a coach, right? As coaches, we often swing from blame and punishment to permissiveness. And maybe we practice empathy and we're good at showing understanding, but we fail to practice empathy and accountability. We let them off the hook. We rescue them from the consequences of their poor decisions, and we make excuses for them. Oftentimes, I hear coaches label this grace, right? When I hear coaches talk a lot about grace, I start to worry. Giving your players grace, that's often code for, I'm just going to give them more chances, more do-overs without consequences. Now, I'm all about second and third chances. I'm all about do-overs. But there need to be consequences. We need accountability. Players need to be held responsible for their decisions. Now, if we practice empathy and accountability, we have a greater chance of avoiding disconnection, a rupture in the relationship. And this is vitally important if we want to have the impact that we want to have. in the lives of our players and build that incredible team culture. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nerman, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Nate Sanderson. Each week, in around 30 minutes, we discuss common issues and challenges in leadership and coaching. Our hope is the two of us and every listener leaves a little more equipped at the end of the day to be a better leader and to build a better culture within their team, within their classroom, their business, and their family. If you want to learn more about how we help coaches, head on over to tocculture.com. You can also get the notes of this episode by just subscribing to our weekly newsletter. Now, we're going to pick up from last week's episode. If you missed it, be sure to go back and listen to that before you listen to this week's episode. We were talking about empathy and where we as coaches struggle there. Now it's time for us to talk a little bit about accountability.
Now, that kind of brings us to the second half of our conversation here, JP, and that empathy alone is not enough. Like, empathy makes accountability, or our efforts to hold players accountable, to ask them to be disciplined, it makes us more effective. But there are also challenges for coaches to hold their players accountable. Now, you just finished up writing a book essentially about this topic here. What are some of the challenges that you see coaches struggle with when it comes to holding their players accountable?
Well, without a doubt, the first place that I see coaches struggle in this is self-accountability. Like, before we can hold our players accountable, we have to hold ourselves accountable. And a lot of the behaviors that we as coaches struggle with when it comes to our players, their mistake response, how they respond to referees, maybe even just some of our own like personal hygiene habits around sleep and nutrition, stuff that we, expect of our players. We don't really seem to hold ourselves accountable to those things at all. And if we're not setting the example for our players, then how can we expect to be able to hold them accountable and them to respond to that in a positive way?
Well, JP, I wrote something similar in the newsletter a couple of weeks ago when I had this informal panel of student athletes in a class that I was substituting in and asking them what makes a good coach anyway. And the number one thing that they came back to, their number one complaint about coaches, is when the coach says you have to be punctual, you have to be here on time, or you run, and then they're late to practice. Or the coach that, says you got to have your jersey tucked in and your hat's got to be a certain way, and then they roll in with their shirt untucked and their hat on backwards. Like, nothing frustrated at least that group of athletes more than when the coach doesn't demonstrate the standard that they're asking them to live up to.
So another area I definitely see coaches struggling when it comes to accountability is when we're really focusing on empathy and trying to understand and show understanding, we can become hesitant to share and tell the truth. And love doesn't exist without truth. And there is definitely a place for us to listen, as we said earlier, and to empathize. But when it comes to communicating truth to our players, we need to be intentional about how we deliver that truth, so that is giving it the best chance of it being received the right way, right? We can't be, throwing 90-mile-per-hour softballs to a 5-year-old, right? When it comes to some of these truth bombs, right? But we still need to give the truth. And I think, and I see so many coaches not share the truth in a way that players actually hear that truth, because they're so afraid of it hurting their feelings or how they're going to take that feedback. And I think that, is a level of accountability that a lot of players are really missing.
Well, I can appreciate that struggle, because what do you hear most about, the impact that we can have as a coach or a teacher? What's the line? They're not going to remember what you taught them. They're going to remember how you made them feel, right? And so when we're having those conversations about playing time or their roles or what's expected of them or areas they need to improve, I do think they're part of all of us, right? Nobody wants to let anybody down or disappoint them or quote unquote make them feel bad. But at the same time, you can't, as you mentioned, you can't have accountability. Like, you really can't have an honest conversation if there are certain topics that, or, subjects or conversations that are off limits. And so, yes, I think you can do that in a way that's tactful. I think you can prepare players for the potential stress of that conversation. But at the same time, I don't think it can be avoided if you're trying to hold the line of accountability with your team.
Now, definitely another area that coaches struggle in a couple of ways with on accountability is the consequences. And I know as a coach, for years, the consequences of not meeting standards, the way I held players accountable was yell, scream, make them run. And as I decided that that was not the best approach, I was left not really knowing what to do. So I see a lot of coaches, and when it comes to accountability, they're very, some people would say it's transactional. It's just very harsh. They use shame, blame, yelling, conditioning type of stuff to discipline. Or, they're kind of just shell shocked and they just kind of maybe throw in and pepper in some encouragement and hope for the best. There's a lot of letting them off the hook. And I think when it comes to accountability, it is tough. We have to deliver. We have to be tough with our players. And that means hold them to a standard. And one of the best ways that I see that, especially around effort or attitude in a practice in those moments, is we can show empathy, understanding that they're having a hard time there. And we can ask them maybe what's going on if we feel like their effort's a little bit off and it's unusual. But we've got to come back to the idea that practice is a privilege. It's an opportunity to get better. Being a part of this team is a privilege. It's not something they should just assume or they're not entitled to. And so we need more coaches that avoid, or we need more coaches that don't jump to this, yelling, screaming, putting them on the line, making them run. But we also need more coaches that don't continuously allow their players to get away with mediocre effort or a crappy attitude. And we need coaches that want to step in and engage and remind them of that privilege, of that opportunity, and just ask them to step out of the drill, ask them to step off that practice until they're ready to come back in and start to work hard or have the attitude that they know they're capable of giving. And I think just how you deliver that message, you can still have empathy and accountability there. And you can instill confidence in there. Hey, I know you're having a tough day, but we know you can meet the standard. I know you're capable. And when you're ready to start coming in and giving that effort that I know you're capable of, you can hop right back in. That to me is a clear moment of empathy and accountability working together.
Well, I think in what you're describing there, JP, in many ways, it's an art form to try to figure out what is the right progressive consequence, so to speak, to reach that player without overreacting to that player, with the ultimate goal of bringing them back to the standard rather than punishing them or alienating them or separating them from the team, whatever it might be. And I think back to an example we had a couple of weeks ago in one of our summer workouts, and in our open gyms, we get a wide range of players from, some of our middle school kids come in all the way up to varsity players, and it's a hodgepodge, right? So this is the week after we had done our high school camp. And one of the things that we talked about at camp was, what does the energy feel like in our gym when we're at our best? Players describe they're vocal and they're encouraging and they cheer for each other and they thank the passer, and all those kinds of things. So we come into this workout and the first 15 minutes are just none of those things. I mean, there's not a good energy level, no communication. There's not a lot of effort. And so we just stopped and I just brought him into the circle and I said, listen, we talked about this last week and we're not doing any of those things. So here's the deal. Like, I'm not coaching us when we're like this. So either we need to come up with something to add some energy or we're just going to go home. And so I asked them, what are a couple of things we can do? We could do this. We could talk to each other, blah, blah. I'm like, all right, we'll try it again. But if we don't fix it, we're taking the rest of the day off. And just, again, we put it in their hands. We let them go back into it. The last 45 minutes were much improved, right? No yelling, no get on the baseline, no threats, no shaming, no putting it on the leadership. It's just a very straightforward conversation. But again, the workout was a privilege, exactly as you said. It's a privilege at the standards that we set for each other. If we don't meet that, try again tomorrow.
And what I love about that story, Nate, is so many other coaches, they complain. They'll go through the whole session or the whole practice. They'll get to the end of it and they'll just get together as a bunch of coaches together and say, our efforts stunk today. That was horrible. They won't have done anything about it except complain about it, or at the end of practice, tell the team, yeah, your attitude stunk today or your effort stunk today. And if you keep that up, we're not going to be champions this year, right? We give that lecture. Bottom line is we get what we tolerate. And this is part of coaching. It's not just teaching the drill or running the offense or the defense. Part of coaching is getting in there and correcting and helping to teach and instruct and hold your players to a standard. So just do your job, stop complaining about it after every practice. They don't work hard. Now, another thing that I see coaches, not just coaches, I see people all across the board do is when it comes to accountabilities, we always want it to be really painful. Like it's got to really suck, or else I'm not really holding them accountable. And yeah, there's definitely times where consequences, you want them to have a little bit of pain there. But it shouldn't be just our pure intent. And it was interesting. We had a team recently where there was an incident between two players in the team that kind of had grown apart as the season had gone along. And, they weren't connecting, and they were kind of used to be friends. And there was obviously, some rupture or damage in that relationship. And they got into a fight in the cafeteria, and they ended up making this big mess in the cafeteria. And it's not a good look, obviously, and all those things. And all the administrators and many, people and coaches are just like, well, that's going to be in school suspensions. And they're going to all the traditional types of punishment. And I remember just thinking, what these guys need to do is they need to make up for their mistake, right? They obviously made a mess. So they should just spend a week together cleaning the cafeteria with the cafeteria staff. It's a way to repay. Hey, we made a mess there. They're going to make up for that. They're obviously taking responsibility for their actions. But it gives them an opportunity to spend 3, 4, 5 hours over the course of a week together, and an opportunity to reconnect and to rebuild that relationship that is suffering at the time. It's what we're really talking about here is don't go at consequences of, okay, how can I make this painful to teach a lesson? Instead, go, what's the real issue here? What's the potential solution to this problem long term?
Well, JP, at the end of the day, in our notes here that we've kind of been working from on this podcast, you put up a graphic from the neurosequential model of sport, which is being designed by Dr. Bruce Perry and Megan Bartlett and some of the friends of the podcast there. And one of the things that comes up in their work, and we've mentioned this repeatedly on the podcast, is that players or adolescents, children, whatever it might be, they develop resilience when they face stress that is predictable, moderate, and controlled, or they have some control in the situation. And the other side of that is when they face stress that is unpredictable or severe or prolonged, they have no control over any of the variables that are causing the stress. That leads them to a place of persistent dysregulation, or they're stressed out and anxious because they don't have any of those variables. So what does that all mean? Like when we're talking about balancing empathy and accountability, what are some good examples? Well, here's one. You go through a season 2, 3, 4 months long, there's going to be a practice or two or maybe more where as a coach, you're going to want to hold your players past the time that you have scheduled for them to leave. And this happens to all of us. We feel the pressure of getting ready for an opponent. So we say, look, we're going to hold you a little bit later. Now, there's 2 ways to approach that. So one is what we've tried to do is ask the players permission. Hey guys, can I have 10 more minutes because I really want to go through these 2 out of bounds plays because I know we're going to see them tomorrow. Now, if the team, are they really going to say, no, coach, we all got to go? Well, sometimes they do. If they're going to another practice afterwards, or they have some kind of an appointment, or they've got to work, and I'll take responsibility for it. My fault we didn't get to that. But most of the time, what I'm trying to communicate is, okay, you can give us permission, number one, so that it's controlled. I'm trying to tell them this ahead of time so it's somewhat predictable and it's moderate. I'm talking about 10 minutes here. Okay, that helps them to build resilience, and there's a partnership involved. I'm seeing their situation, but we're still getting done what needs to be done. I was just having a conversation with one of my former players that played for 4 years college basketball. Just came home. She took a job, and she's been coming to some of our open gyms. And we were talking about this, about coaches that get their players out or don't get their players out on time. And she said, our coach in college, we never knew when we were getting out of practice. And so what that meant was every single day it was unpredictable. She didn't know if she could schedule a study group. She didn't know if she could go work at a certain time because they might go 30 minutes, 45 minutes. Sometimes they'd be filmed. They'd go an hour past what was on the schedule. And so every time she said it, they got toward the end of practice, it felt like this collective anxiety because nobody knew how much longer are we going to have to be here. It was prolonged. It was up to an hour. That's pretty severe when you're just taking that time away from somebody. And the fact that they didn't know when it was going to happen, night in and night out, it led to more anxiety rather than resilience. And I think that's a good example of, as a coach, like a lot of that's on us. I think back to my days as a teacher, and one of the few things maybe that I did well in the classroom is I made a commitment my last couple of years. I told our kids and the parents of our kids, I will never give a homework assignment that's due the next day, because I started to see they're on the road on a Tuesday night, or they have to work. They've got all these things going on outside of the school day. I wanted to, number one, acknowledge that, as we've talked about here, be empathetic to all the things that are going on in a kid's life. But at the same time, there is work that needs to be done. And so by saying you'll always have 2 days to get an assignment done, it doesn't mean it's always going to be easy in those 48 hours for them to do it, but it gives them more control. It's a little bit more moderate expectation, and it's predictable. So they know Mr. Sanderson is always going to give them a couple of days. That helps them to build resiliency versus the opposite, right? Of just saying, this is what has to be done. It's got to be due here because that's what my timeline says. And so I think the more that we can do to partner with our players to understand the situations that they're coming from, and I'll do this with my captains, JP, every week. I'll say, here's what I think we need. What's the best way for us to do that? Is it to do film before or after practice? Is it to do weights on Monday or Tuesday? Like, I give them some ownership over the schedule without necessarily moving the goalposts back all the time. If I get any sort of pushback or brushback, we try to be solution oriented and work together towards it, so that, yes, we can be accountable to the things that need to be done, but we can do so in a way where we're seeing the plight of the athlete and the struggles and some of their obstacles, and trying to work together to find the best path forward.
Well, it's just like my friend Jack Easterby says. Jack's the former culture coach of the New England Patriots and general manager of the Houston Texans. And Jack says, accountability starts with accounting for one's ability. And this requires us getting to the root of the problem. As coaches, we have a responsibility to help develop the skills, the character in our players. We have a responsibility to hold them accountable. But we are not responsible for them. We are not responsible for their poor choices. We just have a responsibility to coach and mentor them, and that requires both empathy and accountability. Now, if the last 2 episodes resonate with you, if you feel this is an area you need to grow, boy, do I know the book for you. New York Times best-selling, just kidding. My newest book, The Culture System, a proven process for creating an extraordinary team culture. A core of the book is about accountability. So I guarantee you, if you read it, you won't regret it. In fact, it will change you as a leader and your team's culture. You can get it on Amazon. Also, links are in the details of this episode. They are also at myculturesystem.com. It's sold all over the world, so absolutely no excuses to get it, right? Regardless, thank you for listening to the Coaching Culture Podcast.